Good morning. This is Dr. Rutledge, and I'm going to give you a brief talk on the origins of the mini-gastric bypass. So 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to talk today about the history of the mini-gastric bypass. And I start off with a nice map of where I've been invited to go and teach the mini-gastric bypass from Costa Rica, Australia, through Pakistan and India. And so it's been a wild ride. So I'll give you a brief description of the past. Let me turn on my pointer. Okay, well, the early criticisms of mini-gastric bypass are interesting to look back on. So it was too fast. People say I was rushing because the mean operating time was 46 minutes when many people were doing 4-hour Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. The hospital stay was too short. They argued that I did not take out the gallbladder, which was necessary. And now, of course, that's obviously not correct. In the old days, wasn't that old, but there was a demand that the Roux-en-Y have a retrocolic and retrogastric location of the Roux limb. And so mine was criticized, the MGB was criticized because it was anticolic. And that was thought to be a very big deal at the time. Now we can see that that was a misplaced criticism. The MGB was assumed to be the old Mason loop, and all would be suffering from crippling bile reflux. And I'll refer to this briefly in a moment. They thought all the Billroth 2 patients would suffer from cancer. They thought the pouch and the gastrojejunostomy that created was too big, so patients would not lose weight. And one of the amusing criticisms we can look back on is I used email, and they criticized me. They said I had a website. Anyways, the future, I think, of the MGB is exciting because it's growing, but also there's danger. And I'll refer to that briefly while I give a brief history of the MGB. I'm only given 13 minutes here, so I'll go through this quickly. But the MGB, as I said, was born in controversy. Bile reflux is odd because in many series it's common, and in other series it seems to be rare. Excessive weight loss seems to be a problem in some, like the Omega trial, but it's rare in others. Marginal ulcers, similarly, and deficiencies in malabsorption. All these areas are still controversial today, where we see good, honorable surgeons publishing widely divergent outcomes with the mini-gastric bypass. And here's just one example. So for example, bile reflux has been a persistent fear of surgeons who criticize the MGB. And so here's a nice study. For example, Dr. Lee in Taiwan, Dr. Kular in India, and my series show that bile reflux is only found in less than 1% to 2% of patients, and they rarely need revision. On the other hand, many series, including one from India, have shown high rates, and one from Australia recently said 1 in 10 of their MGBs need a revision. And so I point out, as when I go through the history here, that there are 2 possible explanations for this. One is inaccurate reporting, either on either of these groups, or there may be significant differences in technique and management. And so that's why I think today's seminar is valuable to go through that. Of course, things are changing. The lap band has come and gone. Here's the lap band citations by year, and this is the MGB, which is now taking off around the world. We're now seeing, for example, India. There's excellent long-term 10-year data from Dr. Kular in my series of keeping a hemoglobin A1C less than 7 in 96% of patients. This is their data. And we also have shown that the dosage of MGB can be adjusted so that the delta hemoglobin A1C over time is changed and much cheaper than years of the new GLP-1 drugs. So the MGB is rising, and here's some trends from Israel to show what's happening in countries around the world. Over the 2014 to 2018, when this was published, series, basically the mini-gastric bypass went from 0% to almost half of all cases. And the sleeve, which is being recognized by some as potentially a far from perfect procedure, has dropped from almost all to only 1/3 of cases. If that were to continue, then we project that the MGB will be 100% of cases in a few years. But why is the massively popular sleeve declining in Israel? Well, a hint is maybe what would happen if 1 out of 3 of your cases failed? When I consult with surgeons around the world, I often hear now that their most common bariatric surgery is revision of failed sleeves. Here's a study from India of 10,000 patients, and basically revision or weight regain was reported in 3% of MGBs, 15% of Roux-en-Ys, and 10 times higher in sleeve. So a little story about this. Well, where did it all begin? That's what I'm supposed to talk about this morning. So basically a reminder, Dr. Rutledge, myself, I was a trauma surgeon and professor of surgery for 20 years at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And on call for trauma in 1997, a drug dealer was shot in the abdomen 6 times with a .357 Magnum. He had multiple gunshot wounds, and so 9 o'clock on a Thursday night in September 1997, I took him to emergency surgery. So the injuries were located here. He also had gunshot wounds to the rest of the abdomen, kidney, and multiple small bowel loops were removed. But this is the salient portion that I'd like to talk about, because what we did is a distal gastrectomy, a distal pancreatectomy, and splenectomy to manage the trauma to the left upper quadrant. So following this, basically we did a standard reconstruction. So again, many people get confused about the mini-gastric bypass. They think it's new or different. In fact, it's a 120-year-old surgery, and the reconstruction on that September night, now 23 years ago, was a standard gut reconstruction that I've been doing throughout my history as a trauma surgeon and as general surgeon for ulcers, gastric cancer, and other distal gastric problems. And so what we did here is basically a distal gastrectomy, and we did an anticolic Billroth 2 gastrojejunostomy. And that was done for that trauma patient. The next morning, I had a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, and what many of you may not be aware of, because you weren't born then or you don't remember it, but the old Roux-en-Y gastric bypass included a very small short pouch, a roux limb, and we had to dissect through the transverse mesocolon to run the roux limb through a retrocolic and retrogastric position. And if you didn't do that, you were criticized. In this case, the Roux-en-Ys were taking several hours, and the trauma case I had done last night reminded me of the basics of general surgery. So I performed a collis gastroplasty. That would be the new pouch here. So it wasn't obstructive, it wasn't narrow. It wasn't like the theories of the day, which said you had to create a tight, narrow pouch or a small pouch like they did in Roux-en-Y. And then we brought up a roux limb, and the very early ones were done with a 100 centimeter biliopancreatic limb. The operation was brief, the patient did well, and that was the beginning of the mini-gastric bypass. So the MGB is really nothing special. It's basically routine general surgery. And the Billroth 2 is a good, safe operation, I would say, unless it's done wrong. General surgeons know how to use it, and there are numerous publications. For example, the studies from Taiwan show those patients who have had a Billroth 2 gastrojejunostomy for their peptic ulcer disease live a healthier life than those who have peptic ulcer disease without a Billroth 2. So the Billroth 2, not done for obesity, increases the quality of life. It decreases heart attack, it decreases stroke, and it decreases diabetes. That is the plain old Billroth 2. The MGB is basically a plain old Billroth 2. It confused the uninformed surgeons who fear the Billroth 2, but those surgeons who do know how to use it correctly have seen very good results. So I thank you all for this opportunity to give you a little background on the mini-gastric bypass.